I have been told I was past my prime, that I was easy to overlook, that at my age I would not know what was happening until it was too late. They were wrong about women like us. This is Family Ties and Lies, where every story begins with someone deciding that wrong is wrong, no matter how long it took to say so. Subscribe. We have been waiting for you. My daughter-in-law came to my house 3 weeks after we buried Robert, carrying white lilies and a plan she had been building for 9 years. I did not know about the plan yet, but I noticed the lilies. They were the same ones she had sent to the funeral, the same flowers that had lain across Robert's casket. A woman who brings a grieving widow the very flowers from her husband's funeral is not thinking about the widow at all. She is checking a box. The morning Robert died, I made 2 cups of coffee. 41 years of habit. I did not realize what I had done until I was already standing at the counter with both mugs in my hands, steam rising between them. The kitchen so quiet I could hear the oak branches scraping against the back window in the October wind. Robert always took his with 1 sugar and a splash of creamer from the second shelf. I had bought a fresh carton just last Tuesday. The old one was still half full. I stood there looking at his cup for a long moment. Then I poured it down the drain and sat down alone. That is the thing nobody warns you about grief. It does not arrive with weeping and darkness, not after the first week. It hides inside ordinary things. It waits for you in coffee mugs and second shelves, and the habit of buying creamer you no longer need. Our house on Abercorn Street in Ardsley Park was full of those traps. Robert's reading glasses on the table by his chair. The garden calendar he had started filling in for spring. Bulbs written in his careful hand beside dates that would come without him. The permanent dent in the right sofa cushion where he had sat for 32 years. 3 weeks had passed since we buried him at Bonaventure Cemetery on a gray Thursday morning with Spanish moss hanging from the oaks, like the trees themselves were in mourning. 3 weeks without sleeping past 5 once. 3 weeks eating most of my meals standing over the kitchen sink because sitting at the table felt like a question I could not answer. Daniel had not come. He called twice in the first week. Short calls, the kind where you can hear that someone nearby is listening to every word being chosen. He asked if I needed anything. I said I was fine. He said he would come by soon. The second week brought a text. He was thinking of me. Things were hectic. He would be in touch. I read it in Robert's chair with his reading glasses still on the table beside me, and did not answer until morning. I told myself Daniel was grieving too. I told myself people process loss on their own schedules. I had spent 35 years extending good faith, even when the evidence was not cooperating. In business, it is a strength. In a family, I was beginning to understand it can be something else entirely. Victoria called on the 18th day, between 8 and 9 in the morning. Her voice carried the particular softness she reserved for occasions requiring careful handling. Not her natural voice, which had a faster, sharper quality when she was not paying attention to it. This was her considered voice, each sentence preceded by a small pause, as though the words had been weighed. She had been thinking of me constantly. Daniel was so worried. They felt helpless knowing I was alone. And she wanted to come by, perhaps help sort through some of Robert's things. I thanked her and said I was not ready. She said, "Of course, no rush at all." She only wanted me to know she was there. I said thank you and ended the call. I held the phone a moment after, not moving, because something in the call had left a residue I could not identify. The way a room holds the smell of something long after the source is gone. I filed it away and did not return to it for 4 days. Then a car I did not recognize pulled up to the curb in front of the house. Victoria came up the walk with those white lilies, and the expression she wore at charity dinners and neighborhood gatherings, the expression that says, "Someone has arrived, and things will now be properly managed." Daniel was not with her. I opened the door before she could ring the bell. She stepped inside, handed me the flowers, and said I looked better than she had expected, which was a specific cruelty arranged to sound like relief. Then she moved past me into the living room, the way people do when they have already decided a room belongs to them. She chose the chair across from the sofa, not Robert's chair. She was not careless in that way. She smoothed her skirt, folded her hands, and began talking about the future, about arrangements, and what would be best for me going forward. At some point, she stood to refill her water glass and walked past Robert's writing desk in the corner, the small one where he kept the house files. She paused beside it. 2 seconds, perhaps 3. Her eyes moved across the surface, the way a person's eyes move when they are reading something upside down. Then she continued into the kitchen as though she had not stopped at all. I looked at the desk after she passed. The folder marked "Property" sat on top, where Robert had left it 4 months ago. It had not moved since. She came back, sat down, and said something about how Robert would have wanted me to have support around me. I looked at her across the room and thought about 9 years of careful voices and lilies and chairs chosen with precision. I had been asking myself the same question about Victoria for most of those 9 years. Sitting across from her now, I understood for the first time that I had never been fully honest with myself about the answer. Whatever she had come for, it was not to comfort me. The question I could not yet answer was how long she had been planning it, and how far along the plan already was. Victoria was still talking when I stopped listening, not out of rudeness, out of necessity. Because while she sat in my living room speaking about arrangements and support and what would be best for me going forward, I found myself looking at the framed photograph on the bookshelf behind her head. Bay Street, 2015. Robert standing on the sidewalk in his work clothes, looking up at the sign I had just hung. His back was to the camera, but I knew the set of his shoulders. I knew what his face looked like in that moment, even though I could not see it. If Victoria's plan worked, and I was becoming certain there was a plan, that photograph would belong to someone else within the year. I had not spent 35 years building something real to watch it disappear into paperwork I had not read. So I stopped listening to her, and I started remembering what I had built, and who had stood beside me, and what it had cost us both. 1987. Daniel was 5 years old. We were renting a house on the east side of Savannah with a bathroom that needed regrouting and a spare bedroom just large enough for a pressed wood desk, a lamp, and a woman with a telephone and a conviction she could not talk herself out of. I started Harmon Travel and Tours on a Tuesday in March with one client, a retired schoolteacher named Helen, who wanted to see the Amalfi Coast before her knees made the decision for her. I booked her flights, her hotel, a train from Rome to Naples, and a walking tour in Positano through a guide I found by reading the same travel magazine 4 times on the living room floor. I charged her $240 and wrote the number in a composition notebook and sat with it a moment, the way you sit with something both small and not small at all. Robert was on the early shift at the engineering firm that year, picking up weekend construction work when the money ran short. He never mentioned the extra hours in a way that made me feel their weight. He did what needed doing and came home and asked what I needed. One evening, I was on the phone with a hotel manager in Florence, working through a language barrier that was making us both stubborn, and Robert walked in with a cup of coffee. He set it on the corner of my desk without a word and walked back out. He did not hover. He understood that what I was doing required a particular silence around it, and he gave me that silence as naturally as other men give opinions. I have never forgotten that cup of coffee. The small things are almost always the truest ones. The business grew the way things grow when you refuse to stop. By the mid-90s, there were 3 of us in a real office. By 2000, clients were coming from 4 states. By 2015, I signed the lease on the corner space on Bay Street with the tall windows over the river. And Robert drove from the job site on his lunch break to watch me hang the sign. He stood on the sidewalk with concrete dust on his boots and looked up at the letters for a long time. I watched through the glass and saw his shoulders move in a way I had not seen before. When he came inside, his eyes were red at the edges. In 41 years, I had never seen Robert Harmon cry. Not at funerals, not through the months after his mother died, but he stood in my new office and wept. And when I asked him about it later, he said, "I was thinking about the Tuesday you started. You had 1 client and a leaking faucet, and you were so certain." He shook his head. "I always knew you were going to get here. I just did not know how much it would feel like this when you did." Behind me, in the present, Victoria was still talking. I caught fragments of it. The word transition, the word simplest. She was explaining how smooth this would all be, in the patient voice you use for someone you have decided is no longer entirely in the room. I let her keep going. I wanted to know how far she would take it before she noticed I had stopped nodding. There were costs. I do not pretend otherwise. I missed Daniel's high school graduation because 42 clients were stranded in London by a labor strike. He said it was fine. He was 18 and I believed him because I was too stretched to examine what fine meant inside my son's particular vocabulary. A child who stops asking you to come is not a child who has stopped wanting you there. He is a child who has decided to stop being disappointed. Victoria saw that before I did, and she used it. I missed Christmas of 2003 in an Atlanta airport when my connection home was canceled. I called Robert from a plastic chair near a shuttered newsstand, and he said he had kept a plate warm and would see me in the morning. Without resentment, the way he said almost everything. There was a night in Tokyo in 2009 when I called him and heard something different in his breathing. A shortness, a careful quality. I asked if he was all right. He said yes. I had 28 clients the next morning, and I led the tour. He never blamed me for any of it. I was looking at his photograph on the shelf, at the concrete dust on his boots, and the sign above his head that bore both our names, when my phone rang with a Charleston number I did not recognize. "Mrs. Harmon," the man said. "My name is James Whitfield. I was Robert's attorney." A pause. "I have been waiting for you to call. Robert told me you would, when you were ready. There are things he wanted you to know, Mrs. Harmon, things that cannot wait much longer." I looked at the photograph, at Robert on the sidewalk, at the sign he had driven across town in his work clothes to watch me hang. I said, "When can we meet? I want to tell you how a person dismantles a family. Not all at once. If they moved quickly, someone would notice. The secret is patience and the genius of doing it slowly enough that every incident, taken alone, amounts to nothing. Each one is deniable. Each one sounds like an accident when described out loud. The power is in the accumulation, and the accumulation only becomes visible when you finally stop giving the benefit of the doubt." Victoria was patient, and I gave her 9 years of benefit. Christmas of 2018, Daniel and Victoria hosted a party at their house, a few streets from ours, and we arrived at 7 with wine and a cheese platter to find the living room full of people I did not know. Victoria steered us toward a group by the fireplace. She introduced Robert with warmth that was almost convincing. Then she turned to me. "And this is Daniel's mother," she said. "She runs a little travel agency. Isn't that sweet? Not a company, not Harmon Travel and Tours, not 35 years in Bay Street and a client list across 6 states. A little travel agency. Isn't that sweet?" Robert's hand found my arm, just a quiet placement of his palm, and I smiled at the strangers by the fireplace and said how lovely it was to meet them. Then Victoria was already steering us to the next group, and the moment sealed over itself like water. I told myself it was careless phrasing. I had given Victoria 9 years of benefit of the doubt, and had developed considerable fluency in that exercise. Thanksgiving of 2020. Victoria rearranged the seating for a guest she had not mentioned, and I ended up 6 seats from Robert with a view of the centerpiece and the back of a woman I had never met. I watched Robert appear and disappear between the shoulders of strangers through most of the meal. At one point, he looked up and found my face across the length of the table. He held my gaze for a moment and then gave a very small, very quiet shake of his head. Not disapproval, something more like, "This is not worth making a thing of. Be patient." Sitting at that end of the table, I began to wonder whether patience was the virtue I had always believed it to be, or whether I had been using it to avoid looking at something I was not ready to see. Winter of 2022. I was lying awake at 2 a.m. Robert's breathing beside me, already that shallow quality that worried me even when the doctors said nothing was urgent. I picked up my phone to read until sleep came. Victoria had posted a photograph from a family gathering the previous Sunday. I found myself in it eventually, in the far left corner, half my face visible, one shoulder cut by the edge of the frame. The image was composed to center Victoria and Daniel, everyone else arranged around them like furniture. I set the phone on the nightstand. 2 days later, I was working in my study when I heard Victoria's voice from the kitchen. She had stopped by while I was home and had not known it. She was on her phone, speaking with the ease of someone who believes the house is empty. "She's old," Victoria said. "Not cruel, just conversational. a fact confirmed between two people who already agreed on it. She won't know what she's signing half the time anyway. We just need to get the timing right. I did not move. The pen was still in my hand. We just need to get the timing right. I had spent 35 years reviewing documents for a living. I knew what that sentence meant when someone said it about a person who owned property. It meant there was already a document. It meant the only variable was when to place it in front of me. I set the pen down very carefully, not because I was calm, because I needed my hands to be steady while I decided what to do next. I heard her end the call. I heard the kitchen door, her car in the drive. I sat in my study for a long time after that, and something I had been setting aside for 9 years settled into place with the particular weight of a thing that has been true for a long time and simply waited for you to stop looking away. Robert's first hospitalization came in February of 2023. I was in the emergency waiting area making calls when I looked up and saw Victoria in the corridor outside his room. She had arrived before Daniel. She was not inside. She was standing in the corridor, looking through the narrow window in the door, very still, a phone in her hand. She was not calling anyone. She was taking a photograph of the door number, room 214, making note of it. When she heard my footsteps, she turned and put the phone away in one smooth motion, and her face arranged itself into worry so quickly I almost missed the arrangement. Almost. I looked at the narrow window, at the room number, at the way her phone had disappeared into her pocket. I excused myself before Daniel arrived. I went to the parking garage and sat in my car and found a number in my address book I had held onto for 6 years without ever using, given to me by an attorney friend who said, "Keep this, you never know." He answered on the second ring. "James Whitfield," he said. I said, "My name is Margaret Harmon. I think someone may be trying to take everything my husband and I built, and I do not know how much time I have." There was a pause on the line. Then he said, "Mrs. Harmon, I know exactly who you are. Robert told me you would call. I have been waiting." He came on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after we buried Robert, not to see me. I understood that before he said a word. He stood on the front porch with his hands in his jacket pockets and said he needed to pick up his father's fishing equipment, if that was all right, because a man from his office wanted to buy it before the season ended. I said, "Of course," and stepped back to let him in. Daniel moved through the house the way people move through spaces that make them uncomfortable. Too quickly. Eyes ahead. I watched him from the hallway as he went into Robert's study, and I thought, for a moment, that what I was reading in the set of his shoulders was grief. A son who cannot bear the room where his father used to sit. I had seen that before in people. I had felt it myself in every corner of this house for 6 weeks. I was still willing to give Daniel that reading. I want to be honest about that. Even then, I was still extending him the most generous interpretation available. He came back out with the fishing case and one of Robert's old tackle boxes and said thank you and that he would call soon. He did not look at me when he said it. I walked him to the door and watched him go down the front steps to his car. 3 minutes later, I noticed the coat. He had hung it on the hook in the front hallway when he came in, the way he had done since he was 11 years old, and he had walked straight out without it. I lifted it off the hook to take it to the car, and as I did, something shifted in the inside pocket. a heaviness, the particular weight of folded papers. I called his name. His car was already at the end of the block. I brought the coat inside and set it on the kitchen table. I stood there for a long moment with my hand flat on the fabric. Because the part of me that has spent 35 years reviewing documents before signing them already understood, on some level below thought, that I did not want to see what was in that pocket. I looked anyway. That has always been my particular failing and my particular strength. The document was folded in quarters, 8 pages, printed on heavy legal stock, with a notary watermark I recognized from professional use, a raised seal on the final page, and at the top of the first page, in the formal language designed to sound neutral while doing very serious things. Last Will and Testament of Robert James Harmon. I sat down. I read it once, straight through, the way you read something when you are hoping you have misunderstood. Then I read it again. The house on Abercorn Street. Robert's retirement accounts. His 40% share of Harmon Travel and Tours. All of it directed in this document to Daniel and Victoria Harmon jointly, with a provision that I receive a monthly allowance at their discretion for living expenses. At their discretion, I turned to the signature page. Robert's name in blue ink on the line provided. A date from 14 months ago. 14 months ago, Robert's hands had begun to tremble. The trembling had started small, the way these things do. A coffee cup rattling slightly against the saucer. The morning newspaper held with both hands instead of one. I had watched him develop the small compensations without naming what I was seeing, because naming it would have made it permanent in a way neither of us was ready for. By the time of the date printed on this document, he had been bracing and gripping consciously for months. The signature on this page was smooth, unbroken, the cursive of a man whose hand is entirely steady and whose mind is on nothing in particular. Robert Harmon had not written this signature. I sat in my kitchen with the document on the table, and I did not move for a very long time. I did not cry. I did not reach for the phone. I did what my profession trained me to do, which is to follow evidence from where it is to where it must logically go. Daniel's discomfort when he came in. Not grief, or not only grief. The fishing equipment requested by a colleague whose name I had never heard. The coat hung on the hallway hook by a man who had grown up in this house and knew that hook from childhood, left behind by a man who had needed to leave quickly. He did not know the document was in the pocket. I was nearly certain of that. He had worn this coat to a meeting, put something away without thinking, worn it here by accident, and left in the particular hurry of a person who feels watched in a place where they have done something they cannot speak about. He had come for the fishing rods. He had left this coat. I thought about what Whitfield had said from the parking lot at Savannah Memorial 6 months ago. Robert told me you would call. I have been waiting. We had spoken twice since then, brief calls, logistics, a meeting in Charleston scheduled for the following week. The following week was no longer soon enough. I picked up my phone. I found something, I said when he answered. I need to come to Charleston tomorrow, if you can see me. A pause on the line. Not surprise, something more like the pause of a man who has been waiting for a particular door to open. Bring it with you, he said. Whatever you found, bring it. Then he said, And Margaret, the box Robert left you. Have you opened it yet? I looked across the kitchen at the hallway, at the doorway to Robert's study, at the darkness past it, where the small writing desk sat with the wooden box still in its drawer, sealed, waiting. "No," I said. "Bring that too," he said. "It is time." 3 a.m. I sat on the floor of our bedroom with my back against the side of the bed and the wooden box open in my lap. Inside a letter, thick, several pages. A small notebook with a blue cloth cover. A sealed envelope with my name and below it, in Robert's hand, "Open this one with Whitfield." I set the sealed envelope aside and unfolded the letter. "Dear Maggie," not Margaret, not Mrs. Harmon, just Maggie. The way he said my name on our first date in 1979 when I knocked a coffee cup off the edge of the table and he looked at me and said, "Maggie, it doesn't matter." And I understood for the first time that I was sitting across from a man who meant precisely what he said. He wrote the way he talked, without decoration. Can you still have? Across town, in the house 3 streets away, Victoria sat at her desk. The lamp was on. Her phone showed 4 missed calls from Daniel. A document lay open in front of her, 8 pages on heavy legal stock with a notary seal on the final page. She was reading it the way you read something you have read many times before, not for meaning, but for error. Her pen made a small notation in the margin. She did not know that her husband had worn his gray coat to his mother's house that afternoon. She did not know it was sitting on the kitchen table on Abercorn Street right now, with a folded copy of what she was reading still inside the pocket. And it's since that Robert wrote without decoration. The way he talked. He said that in the 3rd year of Daniel's marriage, he had watched Victoria photograph the deed to our house through a gap in the storage room door. He had stood still and decided, in those minutes, not to tell me. I was already carrying enough, he said. He wanted to carry this one thing himself. I had believed for 35 years that I was the one who carried things in our marriage. The work, the clients, the travel, the building. Sitting on the floor at 3 a.m, I understood for the first time how wrong I had been. He had been carrying something too. Something he set down in a small blue notebook instead of in front of me. I opened the notebook. The entries were dated, brief, precise. An engineer cataloging anomalies. A phone call overheard from the back porch. A document photographed through the glass of his car window. A conversation with a notary whose office number he had written down and marked. 6 years of quiet watching by a man who did not want to be right and wrote everything down anyway. The last entry, 3 days before his final hospitalization. Check the visitor logs. 47 minutes. She was alone with me, and I was not alert enough to ask. Ask Patricia. A name and a number were written on a slip tucked into the back cover. At 6.9, see with interested, to men. Victoria's phone lit up. A text from Daniel. She picked it up, read it, set it back down very carefully. His message said, "I think I left something at Mom's. My coat." She looked at the document on the desk in front of her. She looked at it for a long time. Then she stood up and walked to the window and stood with her back to the room. I went back to the letter. Robert had written about Daniel. He did not believe Daniel was a bad man. He believed Daniel was a man who had lost his way inside a marriage to someone skilled at providing direction, and the two things were not the same. He wanted me to have the most honest account he could give. He was careful to say it was not an excuse. Then he wrote what broke me open. You built everything, Maggie. Every trip, every client, every morning you flew somewhere I couldn't follow. You were building something real. I watched you do it for 35 years, and I never once doubted that it was worth whatever it cost. I just want to make sure no one can take it from you after I'm gone. God doesn't waste pain, not a single piece of it. Trust Him. Trust yourself. I love you. I always will. Robert. I folded the letter along its creases and pressed it against my chest. I had not cried since the morning we buried him. I cried now, not for the loss, or not only for that. I cried because a man who knew he was dying had spent 6 years building something around me that I did not know existed. I cried because he had seen what I sensed and believed me without my ever saying a word. And I cried because in the last letter he would ever write, with everything he could have said, he called me Maggie. Just Maggie. Right up to the end. And Confuttered is the device. I drove to Charleston at first light. The road opens past the Georgia border, the marsh light coming in flat and silver off the water. I have driven it hundreds of times. I drove it differently that morning, with the blue notebook in a manila envelope on the passenger seat, and the sealed envelope and the forged will in my bag, and something Robert had been building for 6 years that I was finally bringing to the man he had trusted to help me use it. The brick building near the waterfront was smaller than I expected, a brass plate by the door. I parked and sat for a moment, looking at the building where Robert had come, alone, on the Saturdays he told me he was going fishing. I thought about Victoria standing at her window last night with her back to the room. I got out of the car, straightened my jacket, walked to the door. Whatever Robert had built inside that office, it was time to walk in and use every piece of it. James Whitfield's office was on the second floor of the brick building, up a narrow staircase with a wooden handrail worn smooth by decades of hands. The waiting area held 4 chairs, a side table with a lamp, and nothing else. No magazines, no artwork on the walls. A window at the end of the hall looked out over the rooftops toward the harbor and the morning water beyond. A woman at the front desk showed me in without asking my name. Whitfield was older than I had imagined from our phone calls. Mid-60s, I thought, with gray at the temples and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the particular stillness of a man who has heard difficult things for a very long time and learned not to be moved unnecessarily by any of them. He came around the desk when I walked in and shook my hand with both of his. "Mrs. Harmon," he said, "I am glad you are here." He did not say, "I was sorry for your loss," which I appreciated. He gestured to the chair across from his desk, and we sat down. I laid the manila envelope with the blue notebook on the desk, and beside it, the forged will I had found in Daniel's coat, and beside that, the sealed envelope Robert had marked for Whitfield. I set them in a row and said nothing. He looked at the 3 items for a moment, then put on his reading glasses, opened the sealed envelope, and began to read. He read for 11 minutes. I know, because I watched the clock on the wall across from me. He did not speak, did not make notes, did not look up. He simply read, page by careful page, the document Robert had prepared for this exact meeting. When he finished, he set it on the desk, took off his glasses, and looked at me. Your husband was one of the most methodical men I have ever had the privilege of knowing, he said. In 38 years of practice, I have had perhaps 2 clients who prepared for a contingency this thoroughly. He came to see me 11 times over 6 years. He never missed a scheduled meeting. He always brought documentation. I thought about Robert driving this road alone. On the Saturdays, he told me he was going fishing. 11 times. The trust structure he established is sound, Whitfield continued. Your 40% stake in Harmon Travel and Tours is held in a revocable trust with you as sole trustee and beneficiary. Victoria Harmon has no legal claim to any portion of it, regardless of what any document says, including the one you found in that coat. He tapped the forged will without touching it more than necessary. This is a forgery, a competent one, but the notary whose seal appears on page 7 lost his certification in 2021. I checked when Robert first told me what he suspected. I let that sit for a moment. Robert had thought to tell him. Whitfield had thought to check. 6 years ago. There is something else, Whitfield said. He opened his desk drawer and removed a folder, placed it between us. Robert asked me to monitor any unusual financial or legal activity involving Harmon Travel. 3 months ago, before he passed, I flagged something. Victoria Harmon had been in contact with a commercial acquisition group based in Atlanta. The correspondence indicates she was in preliminary negotiations to sell Harmon Travel and Tours at a price substantially below market value. I looked at the folder. I did not open it yet. How far along? I said. Based on the correspondence, a letter of intent was expected within 60 days of the date of the last email I have here. He paused. That was 8 weeks ago. 8 weeks ago, Robert was still alive. Victoria had been selling my company while Robert was in his final weeks, while I was sleeping in a hospital chair and eating whatever the vending machine offered at 2 in the morning. She had not been waiting for him to die. She had started before he did. I opened the folder and looked at the first page. Then I closed it and placed my hand flat on the cover and breathed once, slowly, the way I have learned to breathe when the situation requires steadiness. I am not certain I have. I will need copies of all of this, I said. Already prepared. He slid a second folder across the desk. And the visitor logs from Savannah Memorial. Robert's notebook mentions a nurse named Patricia. I requested the logs yesterday, after your call. He looked at me over the reading glasses he had put back on. Patricia Simmons. She has already agreed to speak with us. She said she has been waiting for someone to ask. I thought about Robert's last entry in the blue notebook. Ask Patricia. Written 3 days before he was too ill to write anything more. He had known Patricia would wait. He had known someone would eventually ask. I picked up the blue notebook and held it for a moment. 6 years of Saturdays, 11 meetings in this office, a trust, a will, a folder of flagged correspondence, and a nurse's name written in pencil at the back of a small book. "He was very specific," Whitfield said quietly, "about what he wanted for you. He said more than once that you had spent 35 years making sure other people got where they needed to go." A pause. "He wanted to make sure someone did the same for you." I set the notebook back on the desk. Outside the window, the harbor light was moving on the water, the way it does when the morning is clearing after a cold night. I sat with it for a moment before I stood, gathered the folders, and shook Whitfield's hand again. Driving back to Savannah in light rain, my phone buzzed on the passenger seat. A text from Victoria. "Mom, we should have dinner this week. Daniel and I have some things we want to discuss about the future." I read it at a red light. The light turned green. I typed one word and sent it. Sure. Victoria had called it an intimate gathering, a chance for close friends and family to celebrate Robert's life in a way the formal service had not allowed. There were 32 people in the house when I arrived. I knew 11 of them. The rest were Victoria's. Colleagues from the nonprofit she sat on the board of, neighbors from their street, a couple from their gym whose names I had never been told. They moved through Daniel's living room with the ease of people in their own element, pausing at the photographs Victoria had arranged on the side tables, holding wine and speaking in the slightly elevated tones people use when they are performing the act of mourning rather than doing it. The photographs were a careful selection. Robert and Daniel at a fishing lake, maybe 2008. Robert and Victoria at a charity gala, 2019. Robert and me on our 20th anniversary, cropped at the edges to a size that fit the frame Victoria had chosen. A frame smaller than the others. I took a glass of water from the tray a server offered and found a position near the bookshelf where I could see most of the room. Daniel was near the back window. He had a glass of bourbon he was not drinking, and his eyes were moving from point to point around the room with the look of a man searching for an exit that has been subtly removed. When his gaze reached mine, he held it for perhaps 2 seconds and then looked at a spot on the floor just to my left. 2 seconds. After 40 years of being his mother, I noted it and moved my attention elsewhere. Victoria was working the room with the efficiency of someone who has thought carefully about how to do it. She touched arms. She laughed at the right moments. She said Robert's name with a quality in her voice that produced sympathy in people who had not known him, which was most of the people in the room. She moved through her guests with the ease of a woman entirely in her element, which she was, because she had arranged every detail of this element herself. At some point during the second hour, she broke away from a conversation near the kitchen and came toward me. She was carrying 2 glasses of wine, Merlot, deep red, the label facing outward. The specific label, my specific preference, the bottle I kept on the second shelf, the wine I had brought to dinner at her house 3 times in the last 2 years. She had done her research. I registered that without showing it. She sat beside me and offered the glass with the warmth of a woman doing something kind. "Mom," she said, "you've been standing here all evening. Come sit with me for a little while. You don't have to hold this room up by yourself." I looked at the glass in her hand. I had been to Charleston. I had read Robert's notebook. I knew about Patricia Simmons and 47 Minutes and a door that had not been fully closed. I did not know what Victoria had done or not done with those 2 glasses of Merlot, and I did not need to know. I knew her well enough by now to know that accepting something from her required being certain about what it contained. I was not certain. "I think I need some water," I said. "My throat is dry from the drive." I set my untouched water glass on the shelf beside me and moved toward the kitchen. I was gone for perhaps 90 seconds. I came back with a glass of water from the tap. I returned to my spot near the bookshelf and resumed watching the room. Victoria was still in the chair. She had both glasses of Merlot on the small table beside her, side by side. She was speaking to someone I did not recognize, her posture easy, her face arranged pleasantly. But her right hand, which was resting on her knee, had the fingers pressed together in the particular way that hands press when a person is controlling something they would prefer to release. I watched that hand for a moment, then I watched her face. At some point in the next few minutes, she looked over at me and saw that I was holding a glass of tap water, and had been since I returned from the kitchen. Her expression did not change, not a flicker, but the hand on her knee tightened once and then released, and she turned back to her conversation. I had spent 35 years in a profession that required me to notice the things people did not intend to show. I noticed. I stayed another 40 minutes, spoke to the 11 people I knew, and said a genuine goodbye to a woman named Helen who had known Robert from his engineering days and cried in a real and unperformed way that I was grateful to witness. Then I found Victoria near the door. "Thank you for this," I said. It was a lovely evening. Her hug was warm and unhurried. She held it a moment longer than necessary, the way you hold something you are trying to assess. "We need to talk soon," she said, low enough that the guests nearby would not hear. "About some practical things. About the future." "Of course," I said. "Whenever you're ready." I went down the front steps and got into my car and sat for a moment before starting the engine. In the light from the living room windows, I could see Victoria at the door, not waving, not smiling, just watching my car with an expression I had not seen on her face before. It was the expression of a person who has realized that a variable they believed they understood has changed in some way they cannot yet measure. My phone lit up on the passenger seat. A message from Whitfield. The hospital visitor logs came in. "Call me tonight. There is something you need to hear." I started the car and drove home through the dark and the quiet. Whatever was in those logs, Robert had already told me where to look. I got home at 9:30, changed out of my good clothes, and sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and my phone. The house was the particular kind of quiet that only houses with one person in them are ever quiet. I had been living in that quiet for months. I was used to it by now. The way you get used to something that is not all right, but has become familiar enough to function around. I called Whitfield at 9:42. He answered on the first ring. He had been waiting. "The visitor logs are straightforward," he said. "One entry. The date is the 14th of last November, 14 months before Robert died, 6 days after his first cardiac incident. The visitor is listed as Victoria Harmon. She signed in at 2:17 in the afternoon and signed out at 3:44. 1 hour and 27 minutes, not 47. I had misread Robert's notebook in the dark before dawn, counting from the wrong time. 1 hour and 27 minutes. Alone, with a man in morphine sedation who had been told not to sign anything without his wife present. Patricia Simmons filed a voluntary statement with my office yesterday, Whitfield continued. She has been a registered nurse at Savannah Memorial for 22 years. She was the floor nurse on duty that afternoon. I put my free hand flat on the kitchen table and held it there. She said Victoria Harmon asked her to step out and give them privacy. That is a request nurses receive sometimes from family members who want a moment alone. Patricia said she started to comply. She got as far as the corridor, and then she stopped, because something in the way the request had been made did not settle right with her. She has been doing this work long enough to know the difference between a person who wants to say goodbye in private and a person who wants a witness removed. I looked at the kitchen table, at the grain of the wood Robert had refinished the summer before last, the summer he had seemed perfectly well, the summer before the first signs. She did not fully leave, Whitfield said. She stood in the corridor with a door pulled to but not latched. She could hear what was happening in the room. I waited. She heard Victoria's voice. She described it in her statement as very different from the voice the woman had used at the nurse's station when she arrived. She said it was quieter, more precise. The exact phrase she used in her statement was businesslike. I said nothing. The specific words Patricia Simmons recorded in her statement are these. Victoria said, "Just sign here. Robert, Daniel needs this. It's for the family." The kitchen was very quiet. And then, Whitfield said, she heard Robert. He paused. In 38 years of practice, he had learned when to pause. Patricia's statement says his voice was weak. She almost could not make out the words, but she was close enough to the door, and the room was quiet enough. And she is a woman who has been listening carefully to people in hospital beds for 22 years. She heard him clearly. He said 3 words. I already knew what they were. I knew before Whitfield said them. I knew the way you know something that was always true, and you were only now being told. He said, "Where is Maggie?" I sat at my kitchen table with my hand flat on the wood Robert had sanded smooth, and I did not say anything for a long time. He had asked for me. In that room, with that woman standing over him with papers, with a pen, with the particular quiet confidence of someone who has calculated that he is too sedated to resist, Robert James Harmon had not signed the document. He had asked for me. I had been home that afternoon. I had been here, in this house, 15 minutes away, because I had been at the hospital every day for 6 days, and the clothes I was wearing needed washing, and I had not slept in my own bed. And I came home for 2 hours to be a person instead of a patient's wife. 2 hours. I had come home and showered and put on clean clothes and told myself I would be back before he woke up. He woke up. He asked for me. I thought about what Patricia Simmons had done with what she heard. She had stood in that corridor and understood what she was witnessing. And then she had gone back to the nurse's station and written down every word of it in her personal notebook. The small one she kept in her pocket. The one she had maintained for 22 years in a profession where details matter and memory cannot be fully trusted. She had written it down, and she had kept it, and she had told herself for 14 months that maybe she had misunderstood the situation. I knew what that felt like. Telling yourself you might be wrong, choosing not to press on something because pressing costs more than you are prepared to spend. She had come forward anyway. It had taken her 14 months and an article in the Savannah paper and a phone number at the bottom of the page, but she had done it. She had trusted what she heard. "She will testify if it comes to that," Whitfield said. She was very clear about that in our conversation. "Yes," I said. "I imagined she would be." There was a pause on the line. "Margaret," Whitfield said, and his voice had the careful quality I had come to associate with information he was preparing me for. "I have been doing some additional research into Victoria's background. Before she married Daniel, there is something you need to know about." He paused once more. "There was a man named Gerald Ashworth. He lived in Charleston. He died in the winter of 2011. She was already there when I arrived. Margaret Ashworth was sitting in one of the waiting room chairs with her hands in her lap and a leather portfolio beside her. When I came through the door, she looked up with the expression of someone who has been waiting a long time for a particular conversation and is not certain it will go the way she needs it to. She was 69 years old. A quality of steadiness in her face, the look of a person who has thought carefully about most things and does not abandon her positions easily. We shook hands. We went into the conference room together. Whitfield had set out the visitor logs and Patricia's statement on the table. Margaret Ashworth looked at them briefly and then looked at me. "He told me someone might eventually come asking," she said. "Gerald, he said if anything happened to him, someone might come eventually." She paused. I did not believe him when he said it. I thought he was being romantic. Gerald was given to a certain amount of romantic thinking. It was one of the things that made him easy to take advantage of. I asked her to tell me about her brother. She told me. Gerald Ashworth was 63 years old in 2009, recently widowed, recently retired from a law practice he had built over 30 years. He had been married for 31 years to a woman he loved, and that woman had been gone for 18 months. And the particular shape of that absence was one he had not found a way to fill. He met Victoria at a charitable benefit in the spring. She was 29. She had a quality of attention, Margaret said. She made you feel that you were the most interesting person she had met in some time. And when you were a man who had recently lost the person who had been paying attention to you for 3 decades, that quality was not small. They were married in September of the same year. 3 months after they met, Gerald changed his will in November. Margaret found this out afterward from the attorney who had drawn up the new document, and who, to his credit, called her privately to say that he had expressed reservations to Gerald, who had not wanted to hear them. In December of 2011, Gerald had a cardiac episode in the night and did not survive it. 2 nights before it happened, he called Margaret. He told her he had made a mistake with the will and planned to telephone his attorney first thing Monday morning to begin reversing the changes. He said Victoria had been pressuring him about the property assets, and he had not been thinking clearly when he agreed. He was 65 years old and had been in excellent health at his last physical. Gerald died on a Sunday night. The death certificate said heart failure. Victoria handled the estate efficiently. She was gone from Charleston within 6 months, and whatever she took with her, Margaret had not been able to recover any of it. "I went to anyone who would listen," Margaret said. Her voice was even and careful, the voice of someone who has told a story so many times the emotion has been worn smooth. The attorney, the county, an investigator I paid for 4 months until I ran out of money. They all had the same response. "You were told you were wrong," I said. "I was told Gerald had made his choices freely and that my grief was distorting my judgment." She looked down at the portfolio in her hands. "I was told I was a bitter old woman who had never approved of the marriage and could not accept that my brother had chosen someone I did not like." The room was quiet. "I kept the photographs," she said. "It was all I had. I kept them because I thought someday someone would ask." She opened the portfolio and placed photographs on the table between us. Gerald and Victoria at the benefit where they met. Victoria at the wedding in September. Victoria at a charity event the following year. Different occasions, different light. In all of them, Victoria's hair was darker than I knew it, cut differently, her face younger, the lines I recognized not yet established. She looked like someone else and herself at the same time, the way people do before they have settled into the version of themselves they intend to present. But the smile was the same. I had been looking at that smile for 9 years. Across dinner tables and in doorways and in my living room when Victoria sat across from me and talked about the future and what would be best for me. I knew that smile, the way you know something you have studied under poor conditions for a long time, imprecisely, but with a certainty about the essential shape of it. In these photographs of a woman in a city I had never visited, 14 years before I met her, the smile was exactly the same. The slight elevation of the left side before the right, the way the eyes held a focus slightly past the person being smiled at, towards something more useful than the current moment. I placed my hand over Margaret Ashworth's hand on the table. "I believe you," I said. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded once, the single nod of a person receiving confirmation of something they have known for a long time and almost stopped believing anyone else would ever see. Whitfield told us she would be asked to testify when the time came. She said she would be there. I walked out into the Charleston afternoon and stood beside my car for a moment in the early spring light. My phone rang. The number was Daniel's. For the first time since the morning we buried his father, he was calling me. Not a text, a call. I answered. His voice was quiet and careful, in the way of a man speaking near a door he is not certain is fully closed. "Mom," he said, "can I come see you? Alone? Without Vicky knowing I called?" 2 years before Robert died, I was sitting in the Atlanta airport at 11 in the evening, waiting for a delayed flight to Lisbon. I have spent a great deal of my life in airports, comfortable in them the way you become comfortable in places you cannot leave. But that night, for the first time in 30 years, I wanted to go home. Not to the hotel in Lisbon. Home. To Robert in his chair. To the specific and irreplaceable ordinary of an evening I had not been present for. I was sitting with that feeling, which was new enough that I did not quite know what to do with it, when my phone rang. "Daniel, 11:15 at night," I answered. His voice was careful, the way it got when he was in a room with Victoria nearby and thinking about what he could say versus what he wanted to say. "Mom," he said, "I need to tell you something. About Vicky." A pause. I did not fill it. I waited. Then, from somewhere behind him in the house, I heard Victoria's voice. Not words, just the sound of it. And a moment later, Daniel said, "Never mind, it's nothing." "Have a safe flight, Mom," and the call ended. I sat in the plastic airport chair with the phone still in my hand, looking at the dark screen. Alone, in the way you can be alone in a crowd when the one thing you want is to be somewhere else. I knew what had just happened. I had known before he said, "Never mind." The pause and the background voice and the speed of the retreat were a language I had been learning without knowing it. The particular grammar of a marriage that controls what the people in it are allowed to say. I thought about calling back. I thought about getting on the next flight to Savannah instead of Lisbon. I thought about the 28 clients waiting in the morning and the hotel deposit that was not refundable. I got on the plane to Lisbon. I did not call back. Not that night, not the next day, not in the 2 years that followed. I told myself I was giving him space. I told myself that when Daniel was ready, he would try again. I was also afraid. That is the truth I had not said out loud until now. I was afraid of what he had been about to tell me, and afraid of what I would have to do with it once I knew. I had been doing that for years, and it had a cost I was only beginning to calculate. He came to the house on a Tuesday evening, 3 days after his phone call from Charleston. He parked in the driveway and walked up the front steps, and I opened the door before he knocked. He looked tired. Not the tired of not sleeping, which I knew on his face from when he was a boy, but the tired of carrying something for a long time in a posture that was not designed for it. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table, him on the side where Robert used to sit, which he did not seem to notice, or perhaps noticed and chose anyway. He held the cup in both hands and looked at the table. I waited. I am patient when it matters. 35 years in a profession that taught me that the most important things in a room are usually the things no one is saying yet. What Daniel could not see was how little time was left. Whitfield had told me the shape of it. Victoria had a buyer in Atlanta and a signing date that was no longer far off. While my son sat at my table holding a cup of coffee he was not drinking, his wife was somewhere across town finishing the sale of everything I had built. After a while, he looked up. "Mom," he said, "do you remember a call I made to you in Atlanta about 2 years ago?" I looked at my son across the kitchen table. I looked at the set of his jaw, which was Robert's, and the way he held his hands around the cup, which was mine. I looked at the thing he had been carrying that was making him tired in that particular way. "Yes, Daniel," I said. "I remember." He nodded. He looked back down at the table. He did not say what he had meant to say on the phone that night, and I did not ask him to. Some things are not about the words. Some things are about the person sitting across from you deciding to show up, and you deciding to let that be enough for now. He stood up a few minutes later, and I walked him to the door. On the front porch, he turned back to me, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. Then he put his arms around me and held on, and I held on too. And we stood there on the porch of the house where he had grown up, with the October evening around us, and nothing resolved and nothing fixed. He was still my son. He was still in there. His phone began buzzing in his jacket pocket. Victoria's name lit up on the screen where I could see it over his shoulder. He stepped back. He looked down at the phone. Then he looked at me. He pressed the side button and the screen went dark. He put the phone in his pocket. He said good night and walked to his car. I stood in the doorway and watched him go. I did not know yet what he would do next. I did not know if that phone going dark was the beginning of something or just a moment that would be explained away by morning. But I had spent 35 years learning to recognize the difference between a person performing a decision and a person making one. That was a real decision. I went back inside and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet and thought about what it costs a person to make a decision that small, and how much smaller it looks from the outside than it feels from the inside. Whitfield called on a Thursday morning with a number that changed the shape of everything. 31 days, he said. The Atlanta group asked Victoria to confirm the sale is still proceeding. She answered within the hour. The letter of intent is scheduled to be signed in 31 days. Margaret, after that it enters a phase that is much harder to stop. I was at my desk on Bay Street, the Savannah River gray and flat below the window under an overcast March sky. I had been coming to the office every morning since Robert died, because the alternative was the house, and because 35 years of building something does not pause for grief. I told Whitfield I would call him back. I had barely set the phone down when the front door of the office opened and Victoria walked in. She had not called ahead. She crossed the floor with the unhurried confidence of a person who already considers the room hers, and she stopped at my assistant's desk and introduced herself in a voice pitched for the staff to hear, as Daniel's wife. She said she had come to review the client database and the active booking contracts, as she would be overseeing the transition of operations. My office manager, Carol, who has been with me for 16 years, looked up from her screen and did not move. I came out of my office before Carol had to decide what to say. Victoria turned to me, and her face arranged itself into warmth. She said she was so glad I was here, that she had hoped to find me, that she wanted to make this whole process as smooth for me as possible. She said it the way you offer to carry something for a person you have decided is no longer capable of carrying it themselves. I stood in the middle of my own office, the office with my name on the door, the office I had signed the lease for, while Robert watched from the sidewalk with concrete dust on his boots. And I looked at her. "Carol," I said, without taking my eyes off Victoria. "Victoria is not authorized to access anything in this office. Not the database, not the contracts, not the client list. If she comes again, you call me, and then you call Whitfield." The warmth on Victoria's face did not fall away so much as freeze in place, like a photograph of an expression rather than the expression itself. "Mom," she said quietly, "there's no need to make this difficult." "I'm not making anything difficult," I said. "I'm making it clear. Have a good afternoon." She held my gaze for a moment. Then she smiled, the smile I had been looking at for 9 years, the one that did not reach anywhere near her eyes, and she said she would see me soon, and she walked out the way she had walked in, as though nothing had happened that she had not anticipated. Carol exhaled when the door closed. "She walked in like she already owned it," Carol said. "Not angry, not demanding, like she was being generous by letting us know." That was the word, generous. I had spent 9 years letting Victoria define the terms of every room we shared. 9 years of careful voices and chosen chairs, and the slow, patient work of being made smaller in my own family, 1 degree at a time. Standing in my office that afternoon, watching the door close behind her, I understood that those 9 years were over. Not because I had won anything yet, because I had finally stopped agreeing to lose. I went back into my office and sat down and looked at the river and thought about 31 days. 31 days before a letter of intent would transfer the company I had built from a spare bedroom desk to investors in Atlanta who had agreed to pay below its worth because the seller had reasons to move quickly and quietly. I picked up the phone and called Whitfield back. "File everything," I said, "this week. The earliest date the court will take the challenge to the will. That is the date I want." He said Friday was possible. I said Friday. Before I could hang up, he said there was one more thing. Their title search that morning had turned up a claim of interest Victoria had filed against the Abercorn Street house 3 weeks earlier, built on the forged will 3 weeks earlier. That was before Daniel had left the coat in my hallway. Victoria had been filing paperwork against my home while I was still sitting in the quiet after the funeral, eating casseroles neighbors left at the door. She had not waited for permission. She had never waited for anything. "If the will falls, the claim falls with it," Whitfield said. "They are the same fight." "Then we file Friday," I said, "and we make sure it falls." I ended the call and sat in my chair a while longer. The river was the same river. The company whose name was on the glass door had been built across 35 years of early mornings and late flights, and a man who brought me coffee while I worked and never asked me to be smaller than I was. I opened my laptop and wrote to Carol. Effective immediately, no one from the Harmon family except me was authorized to touch client files, booking systems, or records, regardless of what they claimed to represent. "Print it," I told her. "Keep a copy. Note the date and time." Then I called the man who had been with me since before Bay Street, since the office was a converted garage on the south side. I told him what was coming and what would be filed on Friday. The company was not for sale on any timeline, I said, and if anyone claimed otherwise, he was to take the name and send it to Whitfield. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "I figured something was wrong. She had the wrong kind of confidence when she came through here." I told him I knew exactly what he meant. I hung up and looked at the name on the glass door. Harmon Travel and Tours, Bay Street, Savannah. 31 days. We would see. The papers were filed at 9:15 on a Friday morning. By noon, I had 4 missed calls from Victoria. I was at the Bay Street office when the 5th call came in. I answered because I wanted to hear what a person sounds like when a plan they have been building for 9 years begins to come apart. It is the kind of information a forensic accountant learns to collect when available. She asked if I was aware that my attorney had filed documents making serious and unfounded accusations against her and Daniel. I said yes. She said this would be painful for the family, and she wished I had come to her directly rather than involving lawyers. I said I understood. She said Daniel was devastated. I said I would see her when she was ready to talk. She said she would come by that afternoon. I said all right. She arrived at 3. She had not brought flowers this time. I had the coffee made and 2 cups on the table, and I let her in and sat down across from her, the same way I had sat down across from her the first time she came, when she was carrying lilies and a 9-year plan, and I was still trying to decide whether I was seeing what I was seeing. I was not trying to decide anything anymore. She started before she had fully settled into the chair. The sentences came quickly, in an order that told me she had been composing them in the car, looking for the arrangement that would land with most force. She said I was tearing the family apart. She said Robert would be heartbroken to see what I was doing to Daniel. She said Daniel had been a devoted son, doing nothing but honor his father's memory, and I was repaying that devotion by dragging his name into a dispute based on what she called a paranoid misreading of documents any competent attorney would find entirely in order. I sat with my hands around my coffee cup, and I listened to all of it. I did not interrupt. I did not shift in my chair. I let her speak until she ran out of the particular kind of breath that fuels that kind of speech, which is the breath of someone who is prepared more than they have felt and is beginning to notice the difference. When she stopped, I stood up. I walked to the kitchen counter and opened the folder I had placed there that morning before she arrived. I removed the document inside and carried it to the table and set it down in front of her. It was the authenticated copy of Robert's actual will, the one drawn up in Whitfield's office in Charleston over the course of 6 years and 11 meetings, the one with a notary seal that was current, a signature that matched the tremor pattern of Robert's hand in the final year of his life, and 2 witnesses who had known him for 30 years and would say so under oath. Victoria looked at the document. She looked at it for a long time. Her face arranged itself with care, the way her face always arranged itself when it needed to project something other than what she was actually feeling. Then she looked up at me. "We just want what's best for you, Mom," she said. There it was, the phrase she reached for when everything else failed, designed to make the person hearing it feel that any disagreement was a kind of ingratitude. I had heard it so many times that I had come to think of it as a signal, a flag that went up when Victoria needed to remind herself the performance was still running. I looked at her across the table. "I know exactly what you want, Vicky," I said. The name landed the way I knew it would, a small tightening around her eyes, quickly controlled. She hated being called Vicky. She had always hated it, and had never said so, because saying so would have required acknowledging that something I did had an effect on her, and she was not willing to give me that. "And I want you to know," I said, "that Robert knew too. He has known for 6 years. The arrangement on her face stopped working. Not all at once, more like watching a structure lose its load-bearing capacity at each joint until the whole thing becomes something else. She sat across from me, and she was no longer performing, and for the first time in 9 years, I was looking at what was actually there. She stood up. Her hands were not steady. "You will regret this," she said. The voice was not confident. It was the voice of someone stating a hope rather than a fact. The voice of a person who is trying to remember that they still have options when they are no longer certain they do. I walked to the front door and opened it. "Drive safe," I said. She left. I stood at the window and watched her car in the driveway. It did not move for nearly 2 minutes. She was sitting behind the wheel, very still, and I understood that she was doing the same calculation I had been doing for months, except from the other side, and arriving at very different numbers. Then the car backed out and drove away. I went to the kitchen and sat down and permitted myself, for the first time since the morning we buried Robert, to smile. Not the managed kind I had been producing for 9 years of dinners and gatherings. A real one. The kind that comes from somewhere that does not require effort. My phone rang. Whitfield. "Margaret," he said. "A journalist called my office this afternoon. Her name is Eleanor Cates. She covers civic affairs for the Savannah paper, and she says she wants to write about what is happening with the estate challenge." A pause. "She also says she has been on 14 of your tours over the past 22 years. She said she wanted me to tell you she knows exactly who you are." He knocked at 8:43. I know because I had been watching the kitchen clock since I came inside. I opened the door and he was standing on the porch with his hands in his jacket pockets and the look of a man who has been rehearsing something on the drive over and has decided, somewhere between the car and the front steps, not to use the rehearsed version. I stepped back and let him in. He sat at the kitchen table. Not in Robert's chair this time. He sat in his own chair, the one he had used as a boy, and he put his jacket on the back of it and set a small silver drive on the table between us. He looked at it for a moment before he spoke. He said he had started noticing things about 6 months ago. Small things at first, things he could explain away. And then it had not been small anymore. He had put a camera in their home office in January because Victoria spent long hours in there on calls she ended when he came near the door. He had told himself he was probably imagining things and kept telling himself that for 6 months while the recordings accumulated. He said he had downloaded the relevant files onto the drive on the table. He was not looking at me. He was looking at the drive. I did not say anything yet. He said that when he came to pick up Robert's fishing rods, he had found a letter in my desk drawer, folded in thirds and not sealed, sitting on a folder of old receipts. He had not meant to read it. He had been looking for insurance documents, and he had picked it up because he thought it might be one. And then he had read the first line and could not stop. I knew which letter. I had written it at 3 a.m, 8 weeks after Robert died, sitting in Daniel's childhood bedroom looking at a box of his old drawings. I had not sent it because I could not find the line between saying what I meant and making him feel accused of things he may not have fully chosen. He read the letter. He came back 3 days later with a silver drive. That was not nothing. I knew that. I also knew it was not everything, and that the distance between nothing and everything was where we had been living for years and would continue to live for some time. "Daniel," I said. He looked up. I asked if he would come with me to Whitfield's office in the morning. He said yes. We drove to Charleston on a cold Sunday morning, mostly in silence. When we arrived, Whitfield met us in the conference room, and Daniel placed the USB on the table with the deliberate care of someone handing over the last thing that connects him to a version of his life he cannot go back to. Whitfield reviewed the contents with his paralegal, while Daniel and I sat in the waiting room. Daniel had coffee. I had water. We sat on opposite sides, and neither of us spoke, which was fine. We had been practicing this particular silence long enough to know it was not the hostile kind. After 40 minutes, Whitfield came out and said the drive held 5 things. Email correspondence between Victoria and the notary whose certification had lapsed. Establishing the forged will as a coordinated act rather than an isolated one. A recording of Victoria discussing the timeline for the Atlanta sale. A video from the Home Office. Comprehensive, requiring full review. A draft property transfer agreement, not yet executed, that predated the forged will by 11 months. And an older folder, property records for the Abercorn Street house, a valuation of Harmon Travel and Tours, a printout of Robert's investment accounts, assembled into a single file. The earliest page in that folder was dated 4 months before Victoria and Daniel were married. 11 months she had been drafting the transfer, and 4 months before she ever married my son, she had already sat down and calculated what my family was worth. I looked across the waiting room at Daniel. He was looking at the floor. He had already seen all of it. I understood, sitting there, that the folder was the real reason he had come to my door with a silver drive in his pocket, not the forged will, not only a guilty conscience about a document. He had gone looking for proof that his wife was deceiving his mother, and somewhere in those files he had found proof of something worse, that she had never married him for any reason but the one now sitting on James Whitfield's desk. Whitfield said to Daniel, quietly, that he wanted to ask him something directly. Daniel said, "All right." Whitfield asked why he was doing this. Daniel looked at the table for a long time, long enough that the question seemed to have been absorbed into the room without an answer coming. Then he said 2 sentences. "Because she's my mother, and because Dad would have." Whitfield nodded once and went back into the conference room. We walked out into the Sunday afternoon together, Daniel and I, down the narrow staircase with its worn handrail and out onto the street. We did not embrace. We did not resolve anything. I did not tell him that everything was going to be fine, because I did not know if it was going to be fine, and I had long ago decided that the most unkind thing you can do for someone is promise them a future you cannot guarantee. We walked to our separate cars. We stood for a moment on the pavement. "Mom," he said. "I know," I said. He got in his car. I got in mine. We pulled out of the parking spaces in the same direction and drove the first 2 blocks of the return to Savannah in a loose convoy before a light separated us. Same direction. That was all. For today, it was enough. My phone buzzed on the seat beside me. "Whitfield." "Margaret," he said, "we are ready. The hearing is scheduled for Monday." The hearing room at the Savannah Federal Courthouse held perhaps 80 people when full. It was full. The 37 women from Whitfield's waiting room had come. They sat in the gallery in their good clothes again, which told me they had understood that what was happening in that room on Monday morning was a continuation of what had brought them to Charleston, which was the same thing that had brought them to 14 countries over 35 years, which was the belief that some things are worth the trip. Dorothy from Nashville was in the 3rd row with her hat and the silk flower. She nodded when I came in. Eleanor Cates was in the back row with a notepad. Daniel sat in the gallery on the far right side, separated from his mother by the length of the room and the particular arrangement of people who had decided which side of a thing they were on. He had chosen his seat without being told where to go. Victoria was at the respondents' table with her attorney and 2 paralegals, and the careful composure of a woman who has spent the night preparing for a performance. I recognized the composure. I had been watching it for 9 years. She was wearing black and pearls and an expression that said she had anticipated everything that was about to happen and was entirely equal to it. She did not look at the gallery. She did not look at Daniel. She sat with her hands folded and her chin level, and the practiced serenity of someone who has rehearsed this specific posture. She had not anticipated everything. Patricia Simmons was called as the first witness. She was 51 years old, plain-spoken, and had been a registered nurse for 22 years. She described the afternoon of November 14th without embellishment. She had been on duty. She had been asked to give the patient and his visitor privacy. She had started to comply. She had stopped because something in the request had not settled correctly with her, and 22 years in her profession had taught her to pay attention to things that did not settle correctly. She had stood in the corridor with the door pulled to, but not latched. She said Victoria's voice inside the room was different from the voice she had used at the nurse's station. She used the word businesslike. She described the specific words she had heard Victoria say to a man who was deeply sedated and had been told not to sign documents without his wife present. She described the 3 words she had then heard Robert say. "Where is Maggie?" Victoria's attorney cross-examined her for 22 minutes. Patricia answered every question in the same even register she had used on direct examination. She did not get flustered. She did not contradict herself. She looked at the judge when she answered, not at Victoria's table, and her hands were still on her knees throughout. When she stepped down, the room held its breath for a moment before remembering to exhale. Margaret Ashworth was called next. She walked to the stand with the unhurried gait of a woman who has been waiting a long time to say something in a room where someone has the authority to write it down. She gave her name. She gave her relationship to Gerald Ashworth. And then, over the course of the next 14 minutes, she told the court about a man who had called his sister 2 nights before his death to say he had made a mistake and planned to call his attorney Monday morning. Gerald died on a Sunday night. Whitfield introduced the photographs through Margaret. They were projected on a screen at the front of the room, large enough for the gallery to see clearly. Victoria at 29, hair different, city different, 14 years before she came to Savannah and introduced herself to Daniel at a gathering his firm hosted. The woman in the photographs was younger, and the lines in her face were not yet what I knew, but the smile was the same. The elevation of the left corner before the right, the eyes focused on something slightly past the person being smiled at. I watched the jury. I watched the judge. I watched the gallery. The recognition moved through the room like a change in temperature. 2 women in the 4th row turned to look at each other. Neither said anything. They did not need to. They had spent enough years reading people to know what they were looking at when they saw the smile on that screen. And they had the particular stillness of people who have just had something confirmed that they had been hoping was not true. Victoria's hand on the table tightened. She released it and set it flat. The video from Daniel's recording was the last piece of evidence before Whitfield's closing summary. The court's audio system carried Victoria's voice clearly through the hearing room. Her voice without the warmth she cultivated for public occasions, without the careful pauses and the considered tone. Her voice as it sounded when she believed no one could hear her. Precise, efficient, entirely unconcerned with being overheard, because she had believed she was alone. At one point, the recording carried a specific sentence that the court reporter wrote down verbatim, and that I will not forget as long as I live. Victoria said, "She thinks this is about money. It isn't about money. It's about making sure she understands what she was and what she was not." Daniel's chin dropped to his chest when he heard that sentence. He did not raise it again for a long time. Victoria was looking straight ahead, not at the screen, not at the table, at a point in the middle distance that held nothing, and into which her expression had retreated entirely. The recording ended. The room was very quiet. Whitfield stood. "Your Honor," he said, "we have one final piece of evidence. A letter written by Robert James Harmon, signed and notarized, to be read aloud before this court." I heard the court reporter's fingers pause above her keys. The room did not move. The sound of Whitfield opening the envelope was audible in the silence of that room. A small sound, the kind that would be inaudible at any other moment in any other space. In that courtroom, on that Monday morning, with 80 people holding their breath, it was the loudest thing I had heard in a long time. He unfolded the pages and looked at them for a moment before he began. Not reviewing, the way you look at something you want to carry correctly before you lift it. He read slowly. He read about a woman who had started a company in a spare bedroom in 1987 with one client and a leaking faucet and a certainty that required no permission. He read about a man watching her build something over 35 years, from that desk to a corner office on Bay Street, and what it had felt like to stand on the sidewalk and see her name on the sign. He read about a Saturday in 2016 when that man had seen something through a gap in a storage room door, and what he had decided to do, and why he had said nothing to his wife for 6 years. He read, "I didn't tell her because she already carried enough. She carried the business, the clients, the trips, the worry about whether we had enough and whether Daniel was all right, and whether the foundation was solid enough to build on. I just wanted to carry this one thing for her. I am sorry if that was wrong. I have been asking myself for 6 years whether it was." Across the room, Daniel was very still. Victoria was at her table with her attorney. She was not looking at Whitfield or the letter. She was looking at the table surface with the expression of a person who has run out of calculations and arrived somewhere they did not intend to go. There was nothing left in her face of the woman who had walked in that morning prepared for a performance. There was only what remained when everything you have been performing falls away, which in her case was very little. Whitfield read the notebook pages into evidence, with their dated entries and precise language, and the penciled name and number in the back. He read the last entry, 3 days before Robert's final hospitalization, which ended with, "Ask Patricia." He had known. He had written it down and put it in a box and left it for a woman who would find it when she was ready, because he had believed she would be ready. Whitfield reached the final page of the letter. He read, "You built everything, Maggie. Every trip, every client, every morning you flew somewhere I couldn't follow. You were building something real. I watched you do it for 35 years, and I never once doubted that it was worth every cost. I just want to make sure no one can take it from you after I'm gone. God doesn't waste pain, not a single piece of it. Trust Him. Trust yourself." He paused. A long pause. The room allowed it. Then he read the last 2 lines. "I love you. I always will. Robert." The silence that followed was not the held breath silence of before. It was a different kind of silence. The kind that comes after something has been completed, that had been a long time completing. Daniel had his face in his hands. He had not moved for a long time. When I glanced across the room, I saw that his palms were flat against his eyes, pressed there with the particular pressure of a person holding something back they have decided not to release in public. He was not crying. He was reckoning. I knew the difference because I had done it myself in this same building, sitting in a different kind of silence. He had put that recording device in their home office, and he had listened to what it collected, and he had driven to Charleston alone on a Sunday morning. He was not owed my forgiveness, but he was my son. And watching him reckon with what that meant was one of the harder things I have done. The judge allowed a recess of 10 minutes. When court resumed, the proceedings were brief. The forensic analysis of the forged signatures, the notary records, the timeline of the property claim, the correspondence with the Atlanta Acquisition Group. Whitfield had organized the evidence with the same methodical care Robert had used for 6 years of notebook entries, and the judge moved through it with the efficiency of someone who has already formed her view and is now building the record. The ruling took 4 minutes. The forged will was declared fraudulent and inadmissible. The property claims derived from it were voided. The authenticated will, drawn up in James Whitfield's office over 11 meetings across 6 years, was entered as the valid testamentary document. Harmon Travel and Tours was confirmed as the sole property of Margaret Harmon. All claims against the Abercorn Street residents were dismissed. When the gavel came down, I was sitting with my hands in my lap and my back straight and my eyes on the front of the room. I looked up, not at anyone in that room, at the ceiling, its old plaster, its institutional lighting, a moment between me and the person it was intended for. Then I gathered my things. In the corridor outside, I put on my coat. I reached into the inside pocket for my phone, and my fingers found something else first. A small envelope, sealed, with my name on the front, in handwriting I would have known anywhere. Below my name, in the same hand, "Open this when it's over. Maggie." I stood in the corridor of the Savannah Federal Courthouse with the envelope in both hands, and I did not open it. Not yet. I just stood there for a moment, holding something Robert had prepared and placed and trusted me to find. He had always been one step ahead. I put the envelope carefully back in my pocket. There was one more thing he wanted to show me, and I intended to be ready when I got there. The sound of Whitfield opening the envelope was audible in the silence of that room. A small sound, the kind that would be inaudible at any other moment in any other space, in that courtroom on that Monday morning, with 80 people holding their breath. It was the loudest thing I had heard in a long time. He unfolded the pages and looked at them for a moment before he began. Not reviewing, the way you look at something you want to carry correctly before you lift it. He read slowly. He read about a woman who had started a company in a spare bedroom in 1987 with one client and a leaking faucet and a certainty that required no permission. He read about a man watching her build something over 35 years, from that desk to a corner office on Bay Street, and what it had felt like to stand on the sidewalk and see her name on the sign. He read about a Saturday in 2016 when that man had seen something through a gap in a storage room door, and what he had decided to do, and why he had said nothing to his wife for 6 years. He read, I didn't tell her because she already carried enough. She carried the business, the clients, the trips, the worry about whether we had enough and whether Daniel was all right and whether the foundation was solid enough to build on. I just wanted to carry this one thing for her. I am sorry if that was wrong. I have been asking myself for 6 years whether it was. Across the room, Daniel was very still. Victoria was at her table with her attorney. She was not looking at Whitfield or the letter. She was looking at the table surface with the expression of a person who has run out of calculations and arrived somewhere they did not intend to go. There was nothing left in her face of the woman who had walked in that morning prepared for a performance. There was only what remained when everything you have been performing falls away, which in her case was very little. Whitfield read the notebook pages into evidence, with their dated entries and precise language and the penciled name and number in the back. He read the last entry, 3 days before Robert's final hospitalization, which ended with, "Ask Patricia." He had known. He had written it down and put it in a box and left it for a woman who would find it when she was ready, because he had believed she would be ready. Whitfield reached the final page of the letter. He read, "You built everything, Maggie. Every trip, every client. Every morning you flew somewhere I couldn't follow. You were building something real. I watched you do it for 35 years, and I never once doubted that it was worth every cost. I just want to make sure no one can take it from you after I'm gone. God doesn't waste pain, not a single piece of it. Trust him. Trust yourself." He paused. A long pause. The room allowed it. Then he read the last 2 lines. "I love you. I always will." Robert, the silence that followed was not the held breath silence of before. It was a different kind of silence, the kind that comes after something has been completed that had been a long time completing. Daniel had his face in his hands. He had not moved for a long time. When I glanced across the room, I saw that his palms were flat against his eyes, pressed there with the particular pressure of a person holding something back they have decided not to release in public. He was not crying. He was reckoning. I knew the difference because I had done it myself in this same building, sitting in a different kind of silence. He had put that recording device in their home office, and he had listened to what it collected, and he had driven to Charleston alone on a Sunday morning. He was not owed my forgiveness, but he was my son. And watching him reckon with what that meant was one of the harder things I have done. The judge allowed a recess of 10 minutes. When court resumed, the proceedings were brief. The forensic analysis of the forged signatures, the notary records, the timeline of the property claim, the correspondence with the Atlanta Acquisition Group. Whitfield had organized the evidence with the same methodical care Robert had used for 6 years of notebook entries, and the judge moved through it with the efficiency of someone who has already formed her view and is now building the record. The ruling took 4 minutes. The forged will was declared fraudulent and inadmissible. The property claims derived from it were voided. The authenticated will, drawn up in James Whitfield's office over 11 meetings across 6 years, was entered as the valid testamentary document. Harmon Travel and Tours was confirmed as the sole property of Margaret Harmon. All claims against the Abercorn Street residents were dismissed. When the gavel came down, I was sitting with my hands in my lap and my back straight and my eyes on the front of the room. I looked up, not at anyone in that room, at the ceiling, its old plaster, its institutional lighting, a moment between me and the person it was intended for. Then I gathered my things in the corridor outside. I put on my coat. I reached into the inside pocket for my phone, and my fingers found something else first. A small envelope, sealed, with my name on the front, in handwriting I would have known anywhere. Below my name, in the same hand, "Open this when it's over. Maggie." I stood in the corridor of the Savannah Federal Courthouse with the envelope in both hands, and I did not open it. Not yet. I just stood there for a moment, holding something Robert had prepared and placed and trusted me to find. He had always been one step ahead. I put the envelope carefully back in my pocket. There was one more thing he wanted to show me, and I intended to be ready when I got there. 2 weeks after the hearing, my assistant director brought a folder to my desk on Bay Street and set it down with the careful expression of someone delivering something they are not certain how to characterize. Those 2 weeks had been occupied with legal formalities, most of which Whitfield handled. Victoria did not appeal, Daniel did not call, and I did not call him. The house on Abercorn Street was mine. The company was mine. What came next between my son and me was a question for a different season. He said a booking had come to his attention while reconciling the client database, a reservation that had been placed the previous spring and had not been reviewed since. The client name was R. Harmon. The destination was the Amalfi Coast, a small hotel on a cliff above the Tyrrhenian Sea, specifically requested, with a balcony facing south. The dates corresponded to our wedding anniversary. He asked if I wanted him to cancel it. I looked at the booking confirmation for a long moment. The date it had been placed was 6 months before Robert's diagnosis was upgraded to the stage that changed everything. He had been healthy enough that spring to drive to Charleston for meetings, healthy enough to work in the garden, healthy enough to book a trip he had not told me about because he was keeping it as a surprise. A trip to Amalfi for our 42nd anniversary. A balcony facing south. I told my assistant director to keep the reservation. I said I would go. I arrived in Positano on a Tuesday morning in April, the year after we buried him. The drive from Naples along the coastal road is not for the uncertain of heart. The cliffs drop to the water, and the sea below is a color that takes some believing. I had been on that road before with tour groups and had always managed without looking at the view because there was always something to attend to. There was nothing to attend to now except the view. The hotel was small, the balcony exactly what the booking had specified, facing south over the water, with a small iron table and 2 chairs, and a view that had the quality of something Robert would have planned specifically. He had always had a precise understanding of what I needed and had rarely pointed it out. I made coffee from the small machine in the room and brought it outside. 1 cup. I had been making 1 cup for months now, out of accuracy rather than grief. 1 cup was the correct number for the person currently sitting at this table. I sat with the coffee and the sea and the morning, and I took the envelope out of the inside pocket of my jacket. It had been there since the corridor of the federal courthouse. I had carried it for 2 weeks without opening it, because I had wanted to open it here, in the place Robert had chosen for us, even if he would not be in the second chair. Inside was a photograph. Us, our wedding day, 41 years ago. I was 24. Robert was 26. And we were standing outside the church in Savannah, with the live oak trees behind us and the sun coming through the Spanish moss. And we were both laughing at something the photographer had not yet called ready for. I had forgotten what had made us laugh that day. The photograph had not forgotten. It was all there. The particular quality of that afternoon. I turned the photograph over. Robert had written on the back in his careful engineer's hand, "Save me a seat at the table. Maggie, I'll find you." And below that, just the initial E.R. I held the photograph for a long time. The sea below the balcony was doing what the sea does in the morning, moving and changing and staying entirely itself. And the coffee was getting cold, and I did not care about either of those things. He had put a photograph of our wedding day in an envelope and placed it somewhere he knew I would find it after it was over. Everything he had done, all the careful preparation, the trips to Charleston that were not fishing trips, the trust and the documents and the notebook, all of it in the same hand, all of it for the same reason. I placed the photograph against my heart, the way I had placed the letter on the night I first read it, on the floor of our bedroom in the dark before dawn. Then I picked up my coffee and looked out at the Tyrrhenian Sea. God doesn't waste pain. He had said it to me for 41 years, and I had heard it as comfort and as instruction. Sitting on a balcony in Amalfi with his photograph and a cup of coffee gone cold, I understood it as neither. It was simply an observation he had found true enough to repeat. Not a single piece of it wasted. The years building something real, the years he spent quietly making sure no one could take it, the pain of losing him, the fight to keep what we had built. The letter read aloud in a room full of people who had decided to be there. None of it wasted. I finished the coffee. I set the cup down. I looked at the sea for a while longer. Then I went inside to get ready for the day. If you have ever been told that what you built was not enough, or that you were not enough, this story was written for you. If you have ever sat across a table from someone who smiled while they planned to take everything you had worked for, and you found your way through anyway, share this story with someone who needs to hear that the woman who built it all in quiet is the same woman who keeps it in the end. And if Robert and Maggie stayed with you today, if their story found its way into something you recognize, we would be honored to have you subscribe. Because there are more women like Maggie, and more stories like this one, and every one of them deserves to be heard. The azaleas came back in April. Robert had planted them along the fence in our first spring on Abercorn Street 32 years ago, and they had bloomed every April since, with the reliable indifference of things that do not require your attention to continue. I had been home from Amalfi 3 months when they opened, and I stood at the kitchen window with my coffee and looked at them and thought, there, right on schedule. That was the morning I decided to go back to full days at the office. I had been going in mornings only since the hearing, letting Carol and the team carry the operational weight. The company had not suffered. 35 years of building something with good people means they know what to do when you step away for a while. But a company that holds is not a company that grows, and growth needed me back. I walked through it on the first Tuesday in April with a coffee from the corner and the feeling of a woman who has been away from herself for some time and is returning to find the self in question has been waiting patiently. Carol looked up from her desk and said, "Good morning, Mrs. Harmon," the same way she had said it for 16 years. Not a ceremony, just continuity. I said good morning and went to my office and looked out the window at the river. That morning I opened the office safe to file the documents Whitfield had sent. Behind them sat a folder I had almost forgotten. The original deed to the house, the original records for Robert's accounts. I had moved them out of the home file in the 3rd year of Daniel's marriage, telling myself it was only good practice. I had never let myself say the rest. When Victoria photographed the deed in our storage room, she had photographed a copy. The original had been beyond her reach the whole time. Robert never once asked me where the originals had gone. He had noticed, I understood now, and said nothing, because he had seen what I had seen in the same year and chosen the same silence. We had each been protecting the other the whole time, him with his notebook and his 6 years of Saturdays, me with a folder in a safe and a fear I never named. I had not been blind. I had only been afraid. And some part of me had reached out years before I was ready to know it and put the one thing that mattered beyond her reach. The first call of the morning was from Dorothy from Nashville, who had taken a 12-hour bus to Charleston to sit in a waiting room in her best clothes and nod at me when I walked through the door. She was calling to book a trip. She had been reading about the Peloponnese and wanted to see the ancient theater at Epidaurus before her knees made the decision for her. And she wanted to know if I could put together something small, no more than 12 people, that would do it justice. I pulled up the supplier contacts I had not opened in months. The ferry schedules and hotel relationships, and the guide network that had taken 15 years to build in Greece. I told Dorothy I thought I could manage something very good. She said she expected nothing less. I started building the itinerary, and it was 11 in the morning before I looked up again. The river outside running high and brown and indifferent to everything on its shores. And I felt like someone who has been in a long and difficult place and emerged to find the world had gone on without her and was ready to receive her back. The letter from Daniel arrived that same week. Not a phone call, a letter, handwritten, on the kind of paper that requires a deliberate trip to a stationery store. He had been trying to find the right words, he wrote, and had concluded there were no right words, only words, and these were his. He was sorry. He understood that sorry was not the same as repair, and that repair, if it was possible, would take longer than either of us could yet see the end of. He was not asking for anything. He only wanted me to know that he understood what his father had spent 6 years preparing for, and why, and that he meant to spend however long it took becoming a man Robert would have recognized. He signed it, Daniel, not Dad, not your son, just Daniel, his own name, offered without a claim attached to it. I read it twice and put it in the drawer where I keep things I mean to return to when I have thought about them enough. Then I went back to the Epidaurus itinerary. Eleanor Cates called on a Friday about a follow-up piece on Harmon travel and the year ahead. I told her she could call Carol to schedule it. She said she had already spoken to Carol. She was calling me, she said, to ask a question that was not for the article. She asked if I was all right. I told her yes. She said, "I know you are. I just wanted to hear you say it." That is what 22 years of trust looks like. Not rescue, not hovering. Just a call to hear you say the thing that is true. I went home that evening by the long way along the river because the April light was doing something particular with the water, and I had nowhere to be. I walked past the bench where Robert and I used to sit on Sunday mornings when Daniel was young and everything was still ahead of us. I did not sit down. I noticed it and kept walking. That is what comes after the hard thing ends. Not forgetting, not replacement, just continuing. The azaleas come back. The river runs. A client calls to book a trip somewhere neither of you has been, and you pull up the files and start building it for her, the way you always have. I got home as the light was leaving the sky. I made 1 cup of coffee. I sat down at the kitchen table, and I opened my notebook to a fresh page. There was a great deal of work still to do.